Hello, welcome to Frequencies, tuning into frequencies of human behavior, perspective, and empathy. I'm Matt. Welcome back. We're here still in the basement of fruity colored lights behind me. If you're watching the video, if you just listen to the show, there is video versions of the show. But we're back here in the studio formerly known as Blue Sky Studios. Today, we're going to have a fun little conversation about narcissism. Now, we all think we know what narcissism is, right? I mean, I catch myself throwing the word around like it's pretty obvious. You know, everything's narcissistic and everything's toxic. And everything's, well, fantastic in its own twisted way. But narcissism is a tricky one. It's not as clean cut as we like to think, in my opinion. So today, I want to share how I see it. And fair warning, my take might be a little different than what you're used to. And of course, I know that's what you're thinking. Of course it is. Of course it is, Matt. Well, that's fair. I get it. But here's the thing. I don't really believe there's one correct version of understanding this. I think perspective matters. And sometimes looking at something from a slightly different angle can shift everything. Because when I think about narcissism, I don't just see it as like a label you stick on a person. Like, you know, that person is a narcissist, end of story. I don't think it's that cut and dry. I don't think it's that simple. Sure, there are people who consistently show those traits, no question. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think it's bigger than that. I see narcissism as something that can exist within the dynamic of a relationship. You know, something that can develop, evolve, and even shift depending on the interaction between the two people. In other words, it's not always just who someone is. It's also what's happening between people. Now, I could be completely wrong about this, seriously, but the more I've learned about narcissism and the traits behind it, the more it feels less like a fixed personality and more like a pattern that plays out between individuals. And that's what we're going to talk about today on Frequencies. So stick around and let's tune in. So narcissism, right? That's the thing. That's what we're talking about. We all know somebody like that. We do. We all have that guy. We all have that girl. We all have that person in our life, in our relationships, whether it's at work or even in our family. You know, they're difficult, really difficult. And like I said in the opener, I see narcissism as something that can develop within a relationship. Husband and wife, father and daughter, son, mother, co-workers, employee and boss. It can happen on a small scale, and in my opinion, it can even happen on a much larger scale too. Employees and employers, society and government. Yes, I said it. We're going to get there eventually. Hold on tight, buckle up. We'll get there eventually. But to me, narcissism is a twisted dynamic. I've spent a lot of time trying to identify it, trying to understand it, and trying to figure out whether there was some kind of test or scenario that I could use to expose these people clearly, make it clear, make it make it visibly, make it, whether it's setting a trap, air quotes, putting them in situations where narcissists will do the narcissist action just so I can say, oh, yes. But honestly, I didn't have a ton of luck with it. What I ended up realizing is that narcissism may be less of a fixed personality trait and more of a relationship dynamic. That means it's not always something you can just point at one person and say, there it is. Oh, you got it. You've got the narcissism. Sometimes it's bigger than that. Sometimes it lives in the interaction itself. And that's why it can be hard to test for. And on a small scale, it can just look like rudeness, control, or dominance. On a larger scale, it becomes much more obvious and much more destructive. So while I was doing some research on narcissism, I naturally looked up the word itself, narcissism, narcissist. I've done this a bunch of times over the years, and I knew it came from the Greek figure Narcissus, who was a young man who fell in love with his own reflection. If you didn't know that, that's what it is. I've looked it up over the years. I've gone down this rabbit hole several times. I always kind of forget the path of which I go, but it often gets me thinking. Once I start thinking along those lines, I go further, of course, and down the wormhole. Because I do love etymology. I start analyzing the words. I love getting to the root of them. And because I think it helps really get to the root of what we're really trying to say. Where did it come from? And once I started thinking about someone falling in love with their own reflection, the word vanity came to mind. Vanity is excessive pride or admiration for one's own appearance. And once I get to pride, I start getting to other synonyms and antonyms. But pride is, in a healthy sense, is perfectly fine. It's perfectly normal to have pride, whether it's a little bit or moderate, even if it's a good amount of pride. Pride is good. Confidence is also perfectly fine. But too much pride becomes arrogance, and too much confidence becomes conceit. That's where things start to turn a little bit. While I'm thinking about narcissism, vanity, pride, and overconfidence, I also start wondering, of course, ADHD, where could you actually find some of these types of people? And so this was years ago, and I was trying to figure out a way to easily spot them, where to find them, where can I find these types of people? And a few places came to mind right away. I know this is going to ruffle some feathers, and I know there's not everybody at these places or that do these things are narcissists. That's not necessarily what I'm saying, but it's a good place to start. One of them is the gym. Now, I know that's going to ruffle some feathers, and I know there's plenty of people at the gym that are genuinely there for their health. I know this, and to those people, I apologize. But then there's also a whole lot of people there that are way more interested in their appearance than their health. And they'll swear up and down that it's their health. But I've worked in gyms before. I used to do quite a bit of work at these gyms. And honestly, I found the environment pretty toxic. It was weird. The smells were bad. Mirrors everywhere. I hate mirrors. I have no vanity. I have very little vanity, I guess. I hate looking at mirrors, always have. So I don't feel comfortable in there already. But you look around and there's constantly people posing and just this self-displaying everywhere. It felt like being surrounded by peacocks, these people just, oh my goodness, it was hard. And that made me think there are probably a lot of narcissistic personalities in this space. And not everyone, obviously, but enough that it really stood out to me. Another place, maybe it's not a place, but another thing that people do, or another area you could look at to find narcissists, is people who obsessively wash their car. I'm talking about, maybe people with car wash memberships who clean their car religiously day after day or week after week. Again, not everyone who does that is a narcissist. That's not what I'm saying. But I think that level of concern about their appearance, how other perceive their vehicle that they're in, is another clue. I'm getting off track, I know, but it's kind of a fun little thought experiment for sure. And especially when you're talking about narcissism and vanity. But anyway, so while I was thinking about vanity and confidence and pride, I started thinking about the opposite too. The opposite of vanity may be modesty or humility. The opposite of pride might be shame or embarrassment, which it's pretty interesting to me. Humility in particular. And that's where I had this little revelation. I've always had this weird question about humility because people use it all the time when talking about overconfident people. It's like a cliche, stereotypical thing to say to someone who's overconfident, like, man, you need some humility. And I always thought of humility as a good thing, which it is. It's quiet confidence. It's knowing your worth without needing to announce it to the room. But then I analyzed it a little further and looked at the word humiliation. When you think of humiliation, it's not the same as humility. Like, why does that happen? What is the reason for humility, which you should have, and humiliation is it's a painful thing. It means losing your dignity or losing self-respect or losing your footing. I always wondered, like, why does that happen? I thought it was a really fun thing to analyze, those two words. So I dug into the root of both words. And both come from the Latin word humus, which means earth or soil or, the ground, which in other words, the grounded, humus, to be grounded, which makes total sense with humility. To be humble is to be grounded. It's to know your place, your value, and your limitations without becoming arrogant. It makes total sense. But then with humility, it takes a little bit harsher meaning. It's like being forced down into that lower grounded position, forced into embarrassment, forced into shame, forced down toward the earth, because humiliation often involves somebody else. That's the difference between humility and humiliation. Somebody forces you to the ground. Somebody forces you to that lower position. They humiliated you. But to have humility is a good thing. I thought that was really interesting. I thought it was a fun little thing to learn about. Other people may have known that. I did not. But I got off track again, and that's a little fun fact for you. It's a little etymology lesson for you. So, anyway, narcissism. I think a good place to start is with dominance and submissiveness, which are real traits in people. Some people are more dominant. Some people are more submissive. And in my opinion, submissiveness is really just another way of saying kind, to be kind, kindness, or at least a close cousin of it. And that might sound strange to some people, but I think a lot of what we call nice is actually just the willingness to submit, yield, or give way. And that isn't always a bad thing. But in the world we live in, being more submissive can put you at a disadvantage, for sure. It makes you a bit of a target sometimes. Think about the phrase, nice guys finish last. I think there's a lot of truth to that phrase. Think about this. If two people both want the same thing, the more submissive person is often the one who backs down. They let the other person take the lead. They give up the last slice of pizza. It's, no, you take it. I insist. Take it. Go ahead. That's considered kindness. He's so nice. He let me have the last slice of pizza. And the other person, usually the more dominant one, accepts it. He wins. He gets the last slice of pizza. And if someone keeps doing that over and over again, people start calling him nice. He's so nice, But what they really mean is that the person keeps submitting in a way. So when you put kindness and submissiveness together, you start to see how the most submissive person can, in a sense, finish last. They give and give and give, And eventually they're left with nothing but the role of being easy and agreeable and accommodating. He's so nice. Think about this for a minute. It's just to drive home how much kindness and submissiveness can shape a person's life. How successful would the nicest man in the world be? Think about that question. Using, our show's version of success, of course. Highest pay, easiest job, best outcome, least resistance. Where would that person end up? And honestly, I think the answer is kind of sad. Because I'd imagine the nicest person in the world would end up with very little, maybe even nothing at all. At least not many of the quote-unquote good things this world has to offer. They would probably keep giving up their share of those things over and over again. Every time something good comes their way, they'd say, oh, no, I insist, you take it. Go ahead, I couldn't possibly, like that. And on the other side of that same equation, they'd be the one taking all of the hard things, the tasks nobody wants, the uncomfortable jobs, the undesirable responsibilities that nobody else wants to be last in line for. They'd take the bad things and give away the good things. And that leads to a pretty sad ending for the nicest person in the world, doesn't it? Of course, I'm being a little facetious here, but that's exactly why the phrase nice guys finish last, I feel stands true, in my honest opinion. There's a lot of truth to that idea. And that's why boundaries matter so much. It's wonderful to be kind. It really is, obviously. But kindness without boundaries can leave you carrying more than your share while everyone else takes the rewards. We all deserve praise. We all deserve fairness and reward at some point. And that's where boundaries come in. Kind people often have to learn to protect themselves. It's not easy. It's really not. Some people think it sounds simple, but for a lot of people, it isn't. Saying no, holding your ground, wanting your share of the pizza, wanting your own agenda for once. It can be hard. But I think this matters. And that's part of why I see kindness, submissiveness, and narcissism all connected. Not the same thing, exactly, obviously, but connected in a way that helps explain how these relationship dynamics develop. Going back to the relationship itself, I think any healthy relationship should be as close to 50-50 as possible. You get the last slice of pizza this time, I get the last slice of pizza next time. Today we do what you want, tomorrow we do what I want. It's pretty simple. It feels fair. That feels balanced. And in a perfect world, that's how relationships should work. But then the balance starts to shift, right? One person gives a little more, then a little more, and then a little more. And before long, the bar keeps dropping. What used to feel fair becomes normal. What used to feel generous becomes expected. And that's where I want to use a different picture. I got another analogy, naturally. So imagine a car driving down the road, trying to get from point A to point B, and they come to a giant hole in the ground, right? Giant hole in the ground. The car can't pass. The car comes to the hole, they stop. Two people in the front seat, driver, person in the passenger seat, look at each other. Our dominant person is driving. Submissive person looks at the dominant person and, says, you know what? I'll get us through this. Hold on. And he walks around to the front of the car. He lays in front of the hole. He lays across the top of the hole. And the dominant person puts it in drive and just drives right over him. Right? Drives right over him. Submissive person gets out, stands up, gets back in the car, a little battered, a little bruised, of course, but, he made it. He's fine. Gets back in the car. Man, good job, man. We're going to get there now. And he's like, yeah, I got you, buddy. They got it. They made it. They come to another hole, right? Next hole, they both look at each other. Submissive person's like, you know what? I'll do it again. It's not a big deal. Gets out, lays on top of the hole. Dominant person puts it in drive. Drives right over him. Battered, bruised, maybe broke a finger bone or an ankle bone on this one. Stands up, gets back in the car. They get to another hole. They do it again. They get to another hole. They do it again. Another sacrifice, another crash, right? And at first, the person laying down in front of the car is being called amazing, helpful, selfless, kind. But the more they do it, the more becomes expected. The more they give, the more the other person assumes they're going to keep giving. Then eventually, they get too old and the person, our nice person says, you know what, I don't know if I can keep doing this, bro. I'm hurting. I think I broke my leg back there. I can't keep doing this. And then that's where we get our narcissistic reaction, right? Because instead of acknowledging the damage, the other person turns the reaction into the problem, right? Classic narcissistic move. Suddenly, it's not about the fact that they kept running somebody over. Now it's, what do you mean? Like, why are you refusing? Don't you want us to get there on time? Do you not want us to get there? Like, do you hate me? Do you want us to be late? It turns their reaction into the problem. And that's the classic move, isn't it? The person who got hurt is now the one being questioned. The person who absorbed the damage is now made to feel guilty for finally speaking up. And that, to me, is one of the clearest signs of narcissistic dynamics in a relationship. The skewed balance becomes the new normal. The sacrifice becomes the expectation. And once the other person stops submitting, the whole thing gets flipped around until the reaction itself becomes the accusation. The reaction to the narcissist behavior becomes the problem to the narcissist. It's strategic and it's dangerous, and it's not fun. I really do think narcissistic tendencies can begin at a very young age, though. And I also think there are certain environments that tend to feed those tendencies more than others. As a father of two, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. My kids are a little older now, but I'm still their parent. I don't get as much time with them as I'd like, but I try. But when they were younger, I noticed something that I think every parent notices. And I was doing things that every parent wants to do. We want to give our children everything. We want to make them happy, give them good experiences, protect them, and help them grow. But kids are human. And they don't always want to do the hard things. They don't always want to try new food, take the tougher road, or hear the word no. And that's where trouble starts. Now, if a child asks for something, gets told no, and then pushes hard enough and cries long enough and gets it anyway, they learn something. They learn that persistence can override boundaries. They learn that pressure works. They learn that no doesn't always mean no. Now, I'm not saying my children are narcissists. Absolutely not. It's not even close. It's not what I mean at all. What I do mean is that if children are never told no, and if they're never taught how to handle disappointment, they can start to expect constant yeses. They get used to getting their way. They get used to softening people up, pushing past resistance, and expecting the world to just adjust around them. And I think that matters. Parenting isn't just about giving kids what they want. One of the most important parts of parenting is teaching them how to fail. Failure teaches lessons that comfort never can. It teaches limits. It teaches consequences. It teaches them that the stove is hot when they touch it. They won't touch it again. If we never let kids experience frustration, if we never set boundaries, and if we always rescue them from the consequences of their actions, we're not helping them. We're teaching them that they're entitled to endless exceptions. And that's where accountability comes in. Accountability is critical, both in parenting and in life. If there are no consequences, there's no correction. And without correction, people can start to believe they're above the rules. They can become more comfortable lying, avoiding responsibility, and refusing to admit when they're wrong. That's something that I think shows up a lot in narcissistic behavior, the lack of accountability, the refusal to say, I did something wrong. I messed up. I shouldn't have did that. The unwillingness to absorb blame. It's maddening. And if you go back to the metaphor of the person laying down in front of the vehicle, that's where it fits. The person who keeps getting run over is hurt. They finally speak up. They say, I can't keep doing this. You're killing me, bro. This is hurting me. But instead of taking responsibility, the other person shifts the conversation. Suddenly, it's not about the damage they caused. It's not about the imbalance in the relationship. It becomes, Why won't you help me? Why are you making this my problem? Why don't you care about me? That's the narcissistic move. It's not about accountability anymore. It's about avoiding accountability at all costs and turning the other person's reaction into the problem. And to me, that's why this starts young. If a person is constantly rewarded for pushing past boundaries, avoiding consequences, and getting what they want, they can carry that pattern into adulthood. Spoiling a child doesn't automatically create a narcissist, but I do think it can help shape the traits that feed into that kind of behavior later in life. And one more little caveat that kind of favors feeding into that type of behavior is often only child syndrome. Only children, not to say that only children are all narcissists, that's not what I'm saying, but only children are often spoiled a little bit more because there's not other children to share, things with. They're told no less. So oftentimes only children have a higher probability of developing narcissistic traits. No data to back that up, but I'm sure if someone dug deep enough, they would probably find that to be true. I said in the monologue that narcissism isn't necessarily just a personality attribute. I see it more of a dynamic in a relationship, and that it can apply to relationships on a much larger scale as well. Take the employer-employee relationship, for example. When a company is actually decent to work for, people notice. Maybe the hours are flexible. Maybe the bonuses are good. Maybe the company seems to care about its people. And in return, employees do their part. That's how a healthy system is supposed to work. You work hard for me, I reward bonuses. We will give you time off. When you want to come in a little bit late, that's fine. But then people tend to take advantage of that. We can't always have nice things. That maybe not that far, but instead of using flexibility when it's actually needed, like getting their kid from school, dealing with the weather, or handling like a real emergency, they start stretching the truth a little bit. Then it becomes occasional, then frequent. Then it turns into a pattern, right? People come in late, leave early, quietly shaving hours off the time they're supposed to be working. And that's not just taking advantage of a system, that's exploiting it. Now, the same thing can obviously happen in reverse too. Employers can absolutely take advantage of employees. And honestly, that version is probably more common today. We've all seen it. Companies expecting more and more and more while giving less and less. More work, more pressure, less play, less respect. That's a whole nother example of the exact same dynamic. But the reaction is really what matters. When someone gets called out for it, they often don't address the actual issue. They don't say, yeah, you know what, I wasn't getting my kid off the bus, or, my kid wasn't sick. Instead, they flip it around. Now it becomes, you don't appreciate me. You're being unfair. After everything I do, this is how you treat me. You know what I've done for this company? That's the narcissistic move. The problem is no longer the lie, the imbalance, or the misuse of trust. The problem becomes the person who noticed it. On the other side of it, employers will never take accountability for their bad behavior in a way. They never do. They'll just fire you in a way because they can. It's 10 times harder, which is why people do it on the other side of it. To take advantage of the company when they can, because they know the company is going to take advantage of them. Which is why so many workplaces become so toxic. And to me, that's the same dynamic we see in the smaller relationships too. It's not just partner to partner, parent or child. It can happen anywhere trust exists and somebody decides to keep pushing until the other person finally breaks. Now, if you zoom out even farther on this, I think you can see versions of this in society itself. Yeah, I told you I'd get there eventually, didn't I? But America was sold as a place of opportunity, a place where the system should help people make it if they're willing to work for it. And in many ways, that's true. There are grants, government grants, and government programs, and tax structures, and legal pathways you could take that are supposed to help people build a life. Immigrants from all over the world came here to have an opportunity of the American dream. But once a system exists, people start looking for ways to work around it naturally. I met this guy once who I worked with him, and he told me that when he would go to different places, like the pool, for example, he'd go straight to the rules and he'd go look over the rules. And he'd said he did this just to kind of see, what was happening. I forgot how he worded it, but the way he worded it was so strategic that he didn't sound like a narcissistic asshole. But he was looking for loopholes. He was looking to figure out what rules people had broken and why these rules were made, just so he can see maybe there's a way I can take advantage of it too. It was so disturbing. The look on my face when he said it was probably shock and all, because I couldn't believe he would say that. And he's not the only one. I'm sure a lot of people do this. It's just pretty disturbing behavior, in my opinion. But that's where loopholes come in. The people who know the tax code inside and out, the people trained to find legal workarounds, the people who can help the wealthy protect money, reducing taxes, and move through the system in ways ordinary people just can't. I mean, there's careers dedicated to finding these loopholes, financial advisors that know how to twist money, work money, structure your taxes in a way to save as much as possible. It's rewarded. That is one of the most successful jobs you can probably have, where it's highest pay, least amount of work, just because you're just taking advantage of loopholes. And a lot of the rich people, a lot of our more wealthy people can pay for these services, which are perfectly legal. But I feel like this is where it starts feeling like a much bigger version of the same thing. This system is supposed to serve everyone, but the people with the money can afford the smartest people to help them bend it and find loopholes to manipulate it. Meanwhile, everybody else keeps paying the highest share relative to what they have. It's pretty frustrating, but perfectly legal. Make it make sense. It feels like a narcissistic dynamic on a grand scale to me. A system that was supposed to be supportive, gets used, stretched, and exploited by the people with the most power. And that's what makes it frustrating, because on the surface, it's legal, organized, and normal. But underneath, it can still be the same old pattern. One side gives more, one side takes more, and the people at the bottom keep carrying the weight. It's pretty frustrating. Narcissism is a twisted human trait. And at its core, narcissism depends on communication. If we lived by our actions alone, there'd be no room for manipulation. The excuses, the verbal gymnastics people use to explain away the damage they cause, actions speak louder than words. But unfortunately, human beings rely on words. We rely on communication every day. And that gives dishonest people room to work. People will say anything to get ahead. They'll say anything to get what they want when they want it. And that's just the truth, unfortunately. But kindness is still the right way to live. I grew up with the golden rule. Treat others how you want to be treated. That made sense to me, at least then. And it still makes sense now. The problem is, I was naive enough to think that everybody else lived by this rule too. They don't. Unfortunately, they definitely do not. In fact, it often feels like people are more willing than ever to treat others however they need to in order to get what they want. That doesn't mean there aren't good people in this world. There are. I just think we're outnumbered. Us kind people, us nice people. I think we're grossly outnumbered. I think people still have those tendencies, but this system has hardened us and turned us into different forms of human beings. Narcissistic behavior can happen in any relationship. And honestly, I don't think the cliche version of narcissist is always the best way to look at it. Some people simply display narcissistic traits more often, more intensely, and with less accountability than others. That's enough to do the damage. So be kind. Always be kind. But be kind with boundaries. Every relationship should be fair. Both people should be giving. Both people should be taking. Both people should be working towards something better in the relationship they want to be. The relationships worth having are the ones that move us forward towards where we want to be, what we want to do with our lives, not backward. If a relationship keeps dragging you down, that's a problem. And when someone keeps crossing your boundaries, you have to hold them accountable. That's especially true with narcissistic people, because accountability is exactly what they tend to avoid. If someone breaks the same rule over and over, believes they're above the consequences, and keeps pushing past the lines you draw, then the relationship needs to be addressed. And if it can't be repaired, it needs to be ended. You need to end that relationship now. To the narcissists out there, I'll say this. Look out. The world is changing. People are getting wiser, and they're getting more aware. We're getting more aware. They're getting tired of being manipulated. It may look chaotic right now, but big change usually does. If you've ever really had to clean like a truly trashed room, it gets worse before it gets better. Everything has to come off the shelves. Everything has to be sorted. It's a fucking disaster. Everything has to be examined. Keep this, throw this away. It's a mess. It's super messy. But at the end, you get order. You get organization. And I think that's what's happening right now. People are cleaning their rooms. They're getting their lives in order. They're learning what they will and won't tolerate. So take accountability or get left behind. Because if you keep living by manipulation, blame shifting, and self-interest, you'll either end up alone or surrounded by people just like you. And that's a miserable place to live. So good luck with that. Guys, I appreciate you listening. If you like this episode, share it, comment. I hope it was helpful. It's just a slight different take on narcissism. We all know what narcissism is, but I felt like sharing it from a different perspective may help people. You may have heard something today that made you realize that somebody in your world is hurting you and you need to eliminate them. Or you may have realized you're hurting somebody else. But if somebody is kind to you, just be kind back. Don't walk all over them. It's pretty simple. Like, share, comment, hit any of the buttons down below. I appreciate it. It helps the algorithm with the podcast, the show here. So I appreciate you listening. You guys take it easy. Later.